I would like to, again, welcome y'all, and then I'll tell you a little bit about Mr. Price. He is a Rutherford County native and a lifelong resident of North Carolina. He is a Navy veteran who served in both the Cold War and the Korean War, and even though he was in the Navy, he spent 2 years teaching at the U.S. Army's Chemical Warfare School in Fort McClellan, Alabama. He received his AA from Mars Hill College and then a BS in Literary History with a minor in History from Wake Forest University. As my family did, and Mr. Price, he grew up hearing of the story from many locals, including his own grandparents. He would sit in front of the fire at their house and hear stories of Lincoln and his origins here, Lincoln's mother, Nancy Hanks, and just the stories that went with it. And he worked with Tom Melton for many years. Tom Melton was from Golden Valley, and he was a local educator, historian, and many other things he did that I'm not aware of. I think Tom Melton really did it all, but it was through Tom Melton's work that the Bostic Lincoln Center became what it is in 2008, and Mr. Price went along with Mr. Melton for many years to different school groups and other organizations telling the story of Lincoln. And the Lincoln Center today is housed in the historic train depot in downtown Bostic. He has done much work in the community, including with local veterans and historic groups. He works and is involved in his church, Mount Pleasant United Methodist, and he is the founding president and president emeritus of Bostic Lincoln Center. If you will please give a warm welcome for Mr. Keith Price.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. I tried to get some material together which we'll pass out after the audio part of it. It's kind of we're not doing exactly the rest of the story like the famous writer used to do in the program, but we are going to go with it just the way it occurred, and we are going to have a bibliography to start off what we'll hand out, and it will be in the form of what came to be after. Like most all history, it starts with mouth to mouth, family to family, and things are added, and some are emeritus, and some of them are not. But one way or another, history generally always starts with oral, passed on until there's some kind of thing is done. And in our case, with the origins of Lincoln, it's very significant that along the way we did pick up things that were occurring at the time. And of course, nobody knew to put up a sign that Lincoln was born here when it happened, but it's getting it got to be about that close before we ever came to the point that after all the traveling together and the western part of 2 states, Tom and I would average at least 2 a month that we'd go somewhere and make a presentation where we were asked to, and that meant all kinds of things. But I want to kind of go at it the same way, and then when we wind it up, we're actually winding up with the bibliography and whatever's been said already by so well. But we really want to do it the way it happened as best I can. And that was when the people started talking about Nancy Lincoln and all the they didn't know Nancy at that time, but before then, the community was talking about the story about Lincoln being born here. And that materialized and kept going for quite a time. And then as we moved along, we started having points of reference put down at the time, very nearly at the time. And so when Lucy Hanks departed the river areas of Virginia and came down here to live in Uncle Dickie Hanks' cabin over on the South Fork of the Catawba River, which is now in Belmont. A marker was put up way back when, not at the time, but shortly after all that materialized, and the marker still sits there at that point where Uncle Dickie Hanks' cabin was. At that time, Lucy had her two baby girls, Nancy and Mandy, or Amanda. I'm not sure which was her true name, but she had those two, and there she was out on the world trying to go around and spin for people. That was what she did. But you can imagine how few and far between her opportunities were with extra mouths to feed when she went to stay with somebody to spin for them. Whatever fiber they had, she would spin. And that was kind of meager. And at some point, Uncle Dickie Hanks died. It's been supposed that it was a fire, and they supposed that some of the remainders of the cabin still exist on the arboretum there in Bostic, the state arboretum, and that's the first marker that took place early on, and from there another marker appeared after three ladies came to meet us up at the newly formed Bostic Lincoln Center. Then they came all the way from Creightonville, South Carolina, to tell us about Nancy Hanks' time there at the Hanks or Tavern. And now there's a marker down there all about that, and the time she was there, when she was working in the Hanks Tavern, and at the same time, young John C. Calhoun was just finishing his law degree and was beginning to travel the court circuit, and he stayed there at the tavern where she worked. That's how they made the contact with her. That marker still exists. We did not take advantage of that. I do not know why. Those ladies came up here. They're long since gone, I'm sure, but they were telling us all about the site of the tavern. The markers are there. It's all down there to be seen, but we never went down and returned the favor to come down and learn what they had to tell us about all that. So that's another opportunity lost, but the markers are all still there. So that's there to affirm the fact that Nancy was staying there at the tavern at the time John C. Calhoun stayed there. He was traveling the court circuits. The other markers appeared as time came around. Whenever what's now called the Mountain Home Museum is at the terminus of the Blue Ridge Parkway as it goes down into Cherokee, and it's run by the National Park Service, and they tell there that is the last home of Abraham Enlow and his wife. And they tell of the time that they mentioned there in the narrative that there was a bond servant that worked there, that lived there, who Nancy Hanks. And that's about all they allege the story. And that came about from a federal investigator that was sent down south to look into all the abuses of the young people in the South. And he did a 700-something page book. A friend of mine found it for me and sent it to me, and it was amazing. He wandered out onto the bottomland at Oconee Lefty, where that was the last home for the Abraham Enlows, and he heard the whole story. And there was a picture taken. Didn't think we'd ever see that again. It was being used as a barn at that time, but there's a marker, of course, well there by the National Park Service. Those things still exist, and of course, naturally, the Bostic Lincoln Center was created based on the firm evidence that Tom and I had come together with the help of wonderful people, meaningful people like Dr. Aaron Hyatt, and so much was gathered by him. He was quite a gifted person himself, and he traced down the last of the Tom Lincoln line living in Virginia. No male children, but he and his wife came down and stayed with me overnight for the 2-day event we had for our kickoff for the Bostic Lincoln Center, which didn't necessarily kick off like we hoped it would, but they were there, and I was amazed because he, being the last of the Tom Lincolns, he said, he could easily said, "Oh, I like it just like it is," but no, he wanted to be there, participate, and insist on trying to get it pinned down while he still lived as to the Tom Lincoln connection, whatever it was. Those things still existed and came along shortly thereafter, as opposed to being a long time coming. Those markers are kind of like a bibliography in themselves, and for that reason I wanted to begin this way. It's when I realized that Tom was not healthy and his wife was not healthy, things were not good, but he did live to have the opening there, such as it was, and he saw enough of what was being built by so many volunteers of us that put the Lincoln Center together after the town of Bostic gave the old Seaboard depot that was later used as their town hall until we are where they're now. But they got us the building, and we put an enormous amount of work and effort into that, and we were ready to go. And at that first meeting we had to determine if there's any real interest here to take it any further, and that meeting turned out to be wonderful. I'd gotten permission from the town to use the town hall, and we had a wonderful turnout, and things looked so good. We were so thrilled to be able to start what we insisted was the greater weight of evidence as to the fact that Lincoln was not, and of course affirmed by academics that came here, took one-on-one depositions from so many people who lived during that time, knew all about Nancy and the baby and everything else, and they affirmed that in writing and made their books for it. So things were building up so well, and we insisted we were ready to proclaim that we have the greater weight of evidence, all things added together, timelines, everything else. And that was exactly what we tried to do, and we were so pleased the way things were going, but we wanted to take it to the next level and put it on some sort of appreciation that lacked here otherwise, and certainly on a state level. So one of the first things I did when I stepped down as president was to obtain a meeting with our state archives, Dr. Cherry, and he was so kind. He and his staff agreed to meet with me an hour, but it was early in the morning, so I went down to Raleigh, spent the night in order to be there on time. And the first thing out of his mouth was this person that I think the county people had paid somebody something to be called a historian, and he said, "She called me as many times as 5 times a day." And that was the stage he was setting for what his concept of Rutherford County was. So we had a wonderful time talking to he and his staff, thanked them for the hour they gave us totally, and I dropped him a note, And so when this handout, you get it, that's some of the many things, the stories about who and when and that sort of thing. And certainly that's the conversation I had and the good terms we left it on. But when I came back and realized we were not about Lincoln's origins over at the Lincoln Center at that time, it had changed completely. But anyhow, Jean Tisdale wrote about her Dacus ancestors in 1864 when the wife was writing her husband, who was in defense of Petersburg and Richmond originally, and said she wrote in the letter, and that's in her book she's put together, Dear Companion, Jean Tisdale. And she wrote, said, around here, aside from a talk of the war, it's how old Abe came from here, and Mrs. Martin saw her holding the baby in her lap when the wagon trains left going west. And it turns out that after they went west, he was riding with Tom Lincoln, who had been obtained by Abraham Inlow. Whenever they moved, their last move after living over here at the creek, they left that in the hands of others who were living there at the plantation, and that wonderful house, refuge that they had built, it was a point of reference itself. It was a meaningful house. And whenever they left here, he had been given that sum of money that Abraham Inlow had been summoned down to South Carolina to bring her back. He had originally, whenever they wound up in Oconee-Lufty, their last home place, for whatever reason, Mrs. Inlow no longer wanted her presence. And I maintain that never in any way did they ever establish that there was any fraternalism to that. But it was Abraham Inlow's job to get her somewhere else. And I asked anyone, well, would he have taken her directly to the place on Puzzle Creek directly and left them with the people that were there then? Or would he have taken to the Hank's Tavern down in Creightonville and took in the gift of the Calhoun family a team, a wagon, and some $500, and he was given that to take her back. And then there again, he still had the same problem. So he wound up taking her to Puzzle Creek with the people that lived there at that time, and that's where she was, either with or without the South Carolina story, which is well founded. I don't think anybody would want to try to dispute them. I think it should be included, just as the way I'm telling it, that she was there, and that's the point we make. No matter what else is talked about, we are about the fact that Nancy Hanks bore her firstborn, a black-haired boy, and named him Abraham, period. Now there's Dr. Hyatt had pinned down this last of the Tom Lincoln line, and they came down here for our meeting and were so enthused about trying to learn the truth about it all. And those things we recognize, and so much a part of what we found out. And as it turned out, they were married in Tennessee by a Methodist deacon. I'm now a Methodist, but I never heard of a Methodist deacon, but that was a term of like stewards. You don't see them anymore or hear of much anymore. But they were married by this Methodist deacon. It may have been one of those that Clarence Griffin, our great historian here in Rutherford County, he's the only one I know of that was ever on the state archives committee as a noted historian in many ways. When he wrote the 100-year history of Pleasant Grove Methodist Church, he told of how significant that little church was to be no larger than it was. They sent so many emissaries into the Wild West of here, which this was the Wild West at that time when all this was taking place. And whenever they were married there by this Methodist deacon, it could well have been one of the emissaries that Pleasant Grove Methodist Church had sent in out to the Wild West, wherever, and had taken Christianity and Methodism into the unknown, and had done so much, and we wound up having circuit riders and others that built from that. But whenever Clarence Griffin wrote that 100-year history of Pleasant Grove Church, he made those affirmations and called it such a significant thing. And it's very likely that this Methodist deacon that did the marriage ceremony and described his description of it, of being accompanied by a small black-haired boy and left with him, and that was probably very likely one of the emissaries that had been sent out by Pleasant Grove Methodist Church right here, and that did the marrying. But whatever the case was, they went on from there and wound up in Kentucky for a time, and then wound up moving after Abraham's mother died. She had imparted a lot that she had learned from her mother, and back to Lucy. Lucy let those children, the two children of hers that did not have a father, she let them both know before she had to bind them out here in Rutherford County, because she couldn't make ends meet after the death of the Uncle Dickie and all that. But she let them know that they were from very meaningful people. They were not just their parentage included some very meaningful people in Virginia. She let them know quite well. Whatever the case was, they wound up, she had to bind them out in whatever fashion they had then, because this was the Wild West itself. But Enloe had come to Yorkville, South Carolina, it was then, from the Low Country originally, but then he obtained a tract of land that I've heard it was an uncle that sold him a considerable tract of land over on Puzzle Creek, and he married a Hedgerton, and they were quite landed people too. So they were not only significant in themselves right here, but that building that built over there is not a Lincoln log building. That's been depicted, but it is a dimensioned lumber creation of a huge building with a stone cellar. The thing that we have left for us to find out now about where the most likely place is the old Lincoln, the old Enloe land up and down the creek there, where he built this very significant building. It was a fortress. It was built by artisans that he brought from him, some with him from Yorkville, some of them. Some might have been slaves even. But they built it. They cut the corners of the shaped dimension lumber so it would drain. No water would not lodge in the cuts of the corners. It was a well-built building. The upstairs was a huge area with gun slits all in it, and it was a refuge in time of whatever was taking place, because this, like I say, this was the Wild West. The not only the Indians, the Native Americans, but it was all kind of bad things going on, and this was a place of reference that was very meaningful and useful for the whole community. So this is a well-affirmed background, and I think that whenever Tom was failing, he and his wife, I realized what was going on, so like I say, I got the permission from the town to utilize their building, and we had our first meeting to see if there was that much interest locally to form what we call the Bostic Lincoln Center, and that was wonderful. From then, things kind of changed, but still, this is the story that we contended then and now and ever, and following the logic of all these various stories and lore, more so lore, which is researched and reaffirmed stories, more than stories. And we still maintain and are going to work at it. I never thought I'd be doing something at my tender age. I would have loved to have been doing this 20 years ago, but just the opportunity never came. But now I'm so appreciative of what it offers to us, and I think that's where we stand right now. We maintain that we have the greater evidence, the greater weight of evidence of the fact that Nancy Hanks, who was a bondservant, bonded out like Mandy, or Amanda, her sister, was in the Stott family in South Carolina, and they were both bonded out, but they were treated. She was treated just like family, and that's where the baby was born. That's what we're about. When Dr. Aaron Hyatt is gone now too, he'll never write that book. I hoped he would, but he was here to give us a keynote speech, and he insisted that the efforts to obtain any of the DNA materials of certified DNA materials of Lincoln lay in the hands of the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, D.C. It was a military operation, and they're the ones that affirmed the remains of all our heroes that they bring from all over the world all the time. They're regarded as the best in the world at it, but they are still a part of the Department of Health, and they're headed by a politically appointed board of governors. Well, I think that tells the story right there. Things are hard to change. That's something that will yet come, but we maintain that has nothing to do with where the baby was born. We'll let that come one time whenever it is determined that the only correct DNA bearing materials, Y chromosome and all that, be regarded like it should, and maybe then learn who really is the father or learn who is not. But none of that matters as to where the baby was born, and we say that the greater way of evidence is here right now. I hope I'm not talking too long, but this is the story, and whenever you get this handout, it's kind of in reverse, but that's where the bibliography is of these various locations that we talked about, monuments and all, and it's also a background about me and the things that, the stories. There's several various examples of how this present day we are living in make it up as you go time in everything, it seems like, and certainly our Bostic Lincoln Center has suffered some of that too. The whole country seems like we're trying to rest with all these problems that come about, rather than having a faith-based world like we were formed. We have to reform it every generation it's something that never ends, and I think we've let our end of it drop, and people are whatever is popular in the various moment. One of the things in there you'll see is I didn't know about it for about a week, but we had gotten a request from the Dr. Thomas More charter school in Chapel Hill. The 5th grade was studying a book that the librarian had gotten, and you can judge from the questions they asked. I don't know what that was supposed to be about, but it was very curious. But I think in trying to answer them, 10 days after I found out that they'd contacted us, and when I called the librarian, she said, well, I don't know if we're able to do anything with it. I said, well, I'm going to answer it and send it all to you, and if you make use of it, fine, but I want to answer it and pass that on to your president of the class and whatever. So that's used in that handout. It kind of tells a lot about the questions people asked and why some of them were asked, but I think you'd find it interesting to see what those 5th grade kids were coming up with, a story that they were coming from some kind of a book, and I don't know who wrote it, but I think it answered a lot of things, so I included that, and some other things, circumstances all around this. And I think we'd like to have time.
I think so. I just wanted to say I have a personal connection to the Lincoln story. My grandfather served on the board of the Lincoln Center for many years. A cousin's wife is the current president of it. And as I stated, I had volunteered there when I was younger. And what I've learned from this is that sharing, I was talking to someone before the program, and how she was saying that those stories that were passed on, as the generations go on, they die out. It's usually not intentional, but stuff that might have been going around in the community about different people, about different places, that gets lost as time goes on. And so I hope that for my generation, and then for those of you who have seen years beyond mine and are very wise in your years, that you would be able to share those stories with your children and your grandchildren. I have a great aunt that knows almost nothing about our family history, but even she, I'm getting to the point, even she talked about the Lincoln story and just the fascination that it's held for 200 years after Lincoln's birth. So I hope that y'all did enjoy this presentation, and that you'll go home and maybe just write down for your kids and your grandkids just things that you have seen in your lifetime in your community, so that way we can preserve this history for future use. Thank you.
We have all grown very quickly to love Leah, but she is related to everybody but 7 people in the world.
That's probably not far from the truth. I think I'm related to half the county.
Okay. Do any of you have any questions you want to ask out loud, or do you want to just go ahead and come up and meet Mr. Price? Yes, sir.
Have you ever heard of the name Nancy Leakey Hollifield?
Yes, there were 2 ladies that got interviewed by the academics that came here and interviewed them while they were still living, Kathy and Coggins. And Coggins' second book, they had a meeting here and went out to the site and had their picture taken at that same time. And those things were so meaningful, but they... Tell me, ask that again like you did.
Nancy Leakey Hollifield is my 3rd great-grandmother.
Uh-huh.
She's buried at Providence Church in the Chase community. She died, she was born in 17...
She lived in 3 generations.
1794.
She and Polly Price. Yeah, she's married. She's buried down here at near. Yeah, and She and Polly Price both knew the situation. They got interviewed, and both of them lived in three generations, three
Centuries. They lived in 3 centuries.
centuries. Yes, they lived in 3 centuries. Polly Price, I'm related to in some way. Of course, all of us came from these land grant things up in Golden Valley, just about, that populated these 2 counties down here in the old cotton belt. But she's purported to be buried over at the Old Concord Church, which the in-laws went to church there, and they're on the record. But the church clerk had taken the records home and were at his house when it burned. So they lost all those records, but they tried to recreate. I've gotten photos of some things that people did from memory, but that was very much a part of those people that were interviewed by Kathy and Coggins, and meant so much to advance this greater weight of evidence.
Is there a tie of Nancy Leakey Hallfield to the Lincoln story? Because in my family, growing up as I was a child, young, there was always a story that they were friends growing up. Nancy Hanks and Nancy Leakey Hallfield were friends as children.
Yes.
Growing up.
Yes, she was very popular, and not treated like a bondservant. She was treated just like one of the family, and that showed in many ways. It may have led to her being too popular, and somebody that Mrs. Enlow, once they were up in Oconee-Lefty, that she didn't want her presence anymore, and that's what led to Abraham Enlow trying to find a place to put her, and wound up taking her to South Carolina.
That was the story in my family, that they were friends, and Nancy was there. My great-great-grandmother was there when she left with Abraham
Yes.
at the wagon train to leave.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
You had a question, sir?
I have lots of questions, but I'll try to hold myself there. I live in Belmont.
Oh,
The land where that marker that you referred to in Belmont, that was originally on my family's property.
yes.
I'm an 8th-generation American.
Uh-huh.
I still live on property that's been in my family since before the Revolution.
Is that part of the what am I trying to say? The arboretum down there.
I'm Ewing. My last name is Ewing.
Yes.
E-W-I-N-G.
Yes.
We fought in the Battle of Kings Mountain.
Oh, yes.
All the revolution, all that. But I remember walking through the woods when there were still a lot of woods around to that marker. We would walk about a quarter mile behind my house through the woods to that marker. Today, that marker is not accessible to the public. It's in someone's backyard. It's fenced in a high-dollar housing development. But my family, it's a crazy story. My family gave over 400 acres to the Stowe family.
Right. They formed that arboretum there.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And like I say, it's a long story. But now I've never heard this about the Hanks Tavern you talk about in South Carolina. Where is that? Can you elaborate?
Creightonville is still there, but it's and they got all the markers and all the truth, and I'm sure although those 3 ladies that came up here to help us learn about that, and we didn't take advantage, they're gone, I'm sure, but I'll bet you there, and it's not far from Clemson. That was all, that wound up, there's a great deal of information that's in the various courthouses back at that time, and Dr.
John C. Calhoun's home place up there.
What's that?
John C. Calhoun's home
Oh, yes, it was, that's what Dr. Hyatt researched when he went down there, and Judge Felix Alley, he had records in the old courthouse down there as well as in the Clemson archives, and that's how that's how it wound up. The strong possibility that the father of Lincoln could be John C. Calhoun.
Does anyone else have any other questions?
Just a comment, the photo you showed on the screen there, one of the Lincoln, of Abraham Lincoln, and one of the Enlow descendants who had such a similar resemblance. The Enlows in Macon County still claim that they're related to Abraham Lincoln. And my brother's first wife, who died of cancer, Jeannie Enlow, was from Macon County, and her son, Jeremy, that taught Chase for a good many years, has a lot of features that look like Abraham Lincoln.
There's so much talk about everybody has a kin folks that look like Lincoln or something, and the thing is lodged right now at us getting correct DNA analysis that I talked about. At this, it ain't going to happen as long as politics like status quo, I'm afraid. But that is secondary to where the baby was born and who the mother was. But it's something that would surely be meaningful, but we're stuck right there unless, every year or two, I know some of these stories break out into various ways. Oh, this guy's got authentic DNA material in Texas. He's going to look through it, and every one of them always play out for lack of really identifying it as being uncontaminated DNA until we can find another one that's equally. We're having to try to convince a board of governors, and that's a shame. But that would be very meaningful, not essential, but it would certainly be meaningful to determine who the father is. And I hope that day will come. And certainly the last of the Tom Lincoln line, as I mentioned, he and his wife came down here and spent 2 days trying to encourage us to make sure that happened and learned about it before he died. He wanted to know.
You mentioned the records of Concord Baptist Church. Probably 50 years ago, I had an opportunity to speak there. And when I went in the foyer of the church, there was a photographic copy of the minutes from the 1860s that had Nancy Hank's name on those minutes on the roll book. Now, I don't know if it was a reproduced copy.
It may be what I've seen is copies that were done from memory after the church clerk Harold house burned. People tried to recreate it from memory as much as possible. It may have been the same thing I've seen. It's a shame it happened, but that's the way that one came to a stop. And whether or not they'll ever be able to recreate that, I don't know. It'd be unlikely.